Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by author and journalist Mark Hollingsworth, and we discuss his excellent book, Agents of Influence, which is all about how the KGB during the Cold War attempted to subvert Western democracies, and how its replacement agency, the FSB, is trying to do the same thing. Just before we begin, if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting us directly by becoming a Patreon subscriber. All you need to do is just go to patreon.com/secrets and spies. And depending on which level you pick, you'll get a free coaster or coffee cup. And also you'll get access to our Patreon exclusive show, Extra Shot, which comes out twice a month after every espresso martini. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you on. So for the benefit of the audience, please can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm an investigative journalist, historian and author. I've been writing books and articles and making TV documentaries since 1983, 84.
Yeah.
And I currently focus on reporting and writing about Russia and the Middle East and the intelligence services.
So you must be a busy man then.
Yes, there's a lot of turmoil in the world, unfortunately, but it's a fascinating situation, so there's plenty to write about.
Yeah, indeed. Well, your new book, Agents of Influence, looks at how the KGB and their replacement, the FSB, have been attempting to subvert Western democracies. And it's a fascinating book. And my first question really is, what inspired you to write this book? And for the benefit of aspiring authors out there, how did you kind of go about researching this topic?
So the idea for writing this book came about during or just after the 2016 US presidential election campaign, where there were allegations of Russian intelligence interference during the 2016 US election. And then you had the investigation by Robert Mueller, the former FBI director, into Russian interference during the election and disinformation and dirty tricks, basically. So I thought to myself, okay, it's being alleged it happened 2016. Did it happen before? Did the KGB and Russian intelligence attempt or interfere in previous US presidential elections and the political process and in UK politics, European politics? So I soon found relatively easily I found just through public records and reading that actually they tried to influence almost every US presidential election since 1944. And every single US presidential election, they tried to either influence it by attempting to even recruit presidential candidates or compromise them or destabilize or find a way of disrupting that US election or, as I say, even recruiting or attempting to recruit presidential candidates. So it showed a sort of pattern, historical pattern of behavior by the KGB. And then I started to look at other countries and then just all the different operational techniques that they used: disinformation, recruitment of agents, fake documents, compromat, and it sort of showed a historical pattern, which then they are still using today in the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, indeed. Well, in your book, you observe that throughout the Cold War, the KGB was used as a ruthless instrument of power rather than just a mere intelligence gathering agency, which is, I think, a lot of academics and historians of espionage sometimes can look at the KGB just as an intelligence service. Now, you mentioned that its roots can be traced back to the Tsar's secret police force of the 16th century. Can you talk to us a little bit sort of about this historical roots that led to the KGB?
Well, I think you can trace the historical roots of the KGB back to 17th, 16th century. Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, all the Tsars of Russia during that period and since. And what's very clear is that the rulers of Russia, whether it was the communists or Tsars or dictators, used their intelligence service as a political weapon, as opposed to
Mm,
preserving the security of the state and gathering intelligence on behalf of the state. It was used as a political secret police to serve and preserve and to damage the enemies of the political power at that time. And so that's the big distinction. And that's what I've noticed in Russia is that they've always been used as a ruthless vehicle to suppress political dissent, harass opponents,
mm,
destroy opponents as a political weapon, as opposed to, checking, investigating spies in their country, security threats in whatever form that takes. So there's a clear distinction there. I mean,
mm.
obviously, the MI6 and CIA are no angels, and they've been involved in all kinds of operations, notably in organizing coups. But I think, that's the main difference.
One interesting thing also came up in that chapter of your book, the KGB and then the FSB sort of saw the Cheka as a sort of badge of honor for Russian spies. And the Cheka was the agency that was set up just after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, isn't it? And that was sort of used as a tool for suppression, espionage gathering, etc.
Yes, I mean, the Cheka, which was set up by Lenin after the 1917 Russian Revolution, and he's almost quite openly, and the head of the Cheka openly stated that it was used as a ruthless weapon to suppress counter-revolutionaries, any political dissent, any opponents of their regime,
Mm,
and by whatever means, lying, cheating. I mean, there was no real rule of law. It was completely politicized, and so again, it was used as a political weapon. And in effect, each period of Russian history with different rulers and dictators and czars and the communists and now Putin. Basically, it's like a private police force. Really, the KGB has been used as a private police force, like a secret private army for whoever's been in power. And after
mm.
the 1970 revolution, it was particularly brutal and bloodthirsty. And that happened, well, it's always happened, but it was particularly bad when Cheka was in power and then under Stalin.
Yeah, yeah. On a slightly side note, I realised that Peter the Great visited my hometown in 1698, in the hometown of Godalming. There's a bit of a sort of weird claim to fame in the town. There's a small plaque on the hotel he stayed in, so it's kind of interesting to have that kind of connection to Peter the Great and to myself.
What's interesting about Peter the Great is that Putin worships him as one of his
Mm,
favorite
mm,
czars, or what if you want to call him that. And but Peter the Great, although and the irony there is that Peter the Great was very interested and promoted European integration, and he wanted to modernize Russia and make it part of Europe almost, and to model the Russian economy on Europe, which is of course what Putin completely opposes.
mm,
But Peter the Great was also, he absolutely ruthlessly used his intelligence service to suppress political dissent and
mm,
spend their time harassing political opponents as opposed to, investigating foreign spies in Russia or securing the border or in terms of real what they should have been doing in terms of as a security service.
mm, mm. Well, after World War II, Stalin grew fearful of growing American and British influence, posing a threat to Soviet sovereignty and its great power ambitions. Can you talk to us about how that shaped the focus of Soviet intelligence and the newly formed KGB in 1953?
Well, Stalin was always paranoid and neurotic and obsessed with conspiracy theories, and he would,
Mm,
rather than objectively assess the situation, he would have his own view on what reality was. And the problem with that is that, he would then always think that Russia was under attack and it was going to be
mm.
invaded, or there's going to be a nuclear attack by the West. And so,
Sounds familiar.
and so he marshaled the
Mm,
KGB. I mean, the KGB was officially um, launched just after Stalin died, but
mm,
it was his mindset after the beginning of the Cold War that influenced them, and so it became again it became an instrument of trying to destabilize and damage the West, as opposed to just gathering intelligence for the benefit of Russia.
mm,
And so they had a preconceived view that the West was going to invade. And obviously, you can understand it to some extent in the history of Russia, constantly being invaded, whether it was Napoleon or Hitler. And Russia's always had this sort of threat, or always feeling that they're being under threat. So that
mm,
colored their intelligence operations. And it was all about, so then it was all about trying to destabilize and diminish and destroy the West
mm.
through what they call active measures, which is primarily what the book is about.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned that the sort of active measures and covert operations were kind of the chief weapon of Soviet foreign policy during the Cold War, even though officials denied that the country spied at all.
Yeah, I mean, officially, I think was it Khrushchev, when he was president of the Soviet Union, even denied that they had any spies and they were just gathering
Mm,
information. But the evidence is overwhelming in the sense of, the forgery of documents, putting out disinformation, um, recruiting of agents, secretly funding political organizations, honey trapping, and whatever
mm.
work, whatever that, they had no limits on their covert operations. Whatever worked, they would do, and there was no restraint.
Yeah, yeah. I find it interesting actually because we talk a lot about imperialism today and obviously Western imperialism, and there are some sort of academics and figures on, should we say, the left or the far left who sort of believe that Soviet Russia wasn't really an imperial power, but it definitely behaved like one, didn't it?
Well, I think there's some substance to that, in the sense that obviously it was an imperial power, in that immediately after Second World War, they annexed and effectively had their empire in Eastern Europe,
Mm,
controlling
mm,
Romania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and so in that sense. But I think my view is that the KGB was used really to attack the West and try and
mm.
destabilize and destroy the West as a sort of
Yeah,
defense
yeah.
mechanism, uh, because they were, in their paranoia and conspiracy-minded theories, and based on history, they always felt the West was going to take them over. So I think in terms of, I have some sympathy with that view, in terms of I never really thought that the Soviet Union was an imperialistic power. I mean, you could argue,
Mm,
they invaded Afghanistan in the 80s, but their interventions in Hungary in 1956,
mm.
Czechoslovakia in 1968, in a sense, was preserving their power base rather than trying to expand as an imperial power.
Mm, mm. Okay, yeah, thank you for that. You mentioned in your book that in Soviet Russia, KGB officers were regarded and portrayed as sort of heroic figures, and as a result, many of them grew to have access to privileges that ordinary citizens could only dream of. Can you sort of just talk to us a bit about this and how it influenced, sort of, should we say, the attitude of KGB officers?
So in Russia and the Soviet Union, KGB officers and intelligence officers were regarded as heroic figures and somehow
Mm,
superior citizens, and it was massively encouraged that this was a noble, honourable uh, position, job to have. And so,
mm,
if you look at Soviet films and novels and books and artwork, certainly after, certainly really from the I would say maybe even going back to 1930s, it promotes this image of a spy, Russian spy, being heroic and patriotic and, part of the elite. Whereas in the UK and even maybe in the US, espionage has always been regarded as a bit grubby, and there's lots of material about Harold Macmillan when he was prime minister, thinking that being a spy was rather vulgar and middle class, and you shouldn't be involved in it, and
mm,
it was always seen as obviously an important role. But Putin himself joined the KGB because of seeing these films and reading books about. So if you're a KGB officer in Russia, you did have an elevated status, and financially you
mm.
were looked after better, you had a better life. Whereas I think in the UK, it's always espionage and being in the MI5 or MI6 or CIA. It's always been a little bit thinking, well, that's a rather, grubby profession, as they say.
Yeah, yeah, certainly away from, should we say, the James Bond image. If you go to like John le Carre, he certainly doesn't represent espionage as a particularly positive or glamorous
Mm.
profession.
Yeah, and if you look at Soviet films and book, they uh, in contrast to James Bond films, they don't
Mm,
really go in for showing the KGB officers, trying to seduce women or having lots of gadgets. It's much more their role as a sort of warrior on behalf of
mm,
Russia to attack the
mm,
West, and using their sort of rat-like cunning and brain and intelligence, rather than having access to lots of guns and gadgets and being in gambling casinos. It was a much more serious-minded profession, being in the KGB, and so therefore, and it was elevated to if you were in Russian society or Soviet society, you were regarded as in a sort of more superior being almost.
mm, mm. Interesting. Well, let's look at some of the methods the KGB used against their main enemy, America and Britain. Can you talk to us about what is an agent of influence and how they have been used by the Russian intelligence services?
So an agent of influence is not necessarily a spy or even an intelligence officer.
Mm,
They are individuals who are recruited as agents, and they could be academics, journalists, politicians, officials, secretaries, anyone who was in an influential position
mm,
that could either gather intelligence or promote things that the KGB wanted to be promoted or to be involved. But they were, and they may well have been paid, but they were never actually officially a spy. They were using their professional status or their political position
mm,
to be agents of influence. So they were an agent of the KGB, and they used their position to influence political events or whatever the KGB's agenda was at the time. And so in my book, I describe three examples of this. And, one was a Austrian Marxist. He was a foreign correspondent, moved to London, and he was recruited by Kim Philby
mm,
to work for what was then the NKVD, which was the predecessor to the KGB. And his name was Hans-Peter Smolka, and he was very much an agent of influence because he was head of the Russian desk of the Ministry of Information during the Second World War. And then I also referred to Robert Maxwell, former owner of the Mirror newspapers, who was also recruited as a sort of basically an agent for the KGB. And then finally, a Russian, again, foreign correspondent called Victor Louis, who was used by the
mm,
KGB to um, uh, promote, to write stories on their behalf or attack opponents of the Soviet Union through his privileged status as a newspaper correspondent. And then they would recruit agents and secretaries in the House of Commons, And that's what agents of influence are, really.
Fantastic. And with the Smolka story in particular is really interesting because of his connection to the film The Third Man, and he may or may not have influenced the plot of that film.
Well, there's certainly evidence. There's no doubt that Graham Greene, who wrote the screenplay for The Third Man, that he spent a lot of time with Hans-Peter Smolka
Mm,
in the late 1940s when he went to Vienna, and they spent a lot of time together. And there's no doubt that at least some of the script was influenced by Smolka. And if you watch the movie, there are actually even one or two references to Smolka in the film as a way of thanking him for his influence. And what's interesting is that, as I recall, an in the original script there was a scene which was seen as a sort of anti-Soviet, and Smolka managed to persuade Green to remove that from the movie. So
mm,
Smolka is a very interesting character and played a very important role, is very much as an agent of influence,
yeah.
working with Philby and Burgess during in the late 30s and throughout the Second World War.
Excellent. And also, you mentioned earlier Robert Maxwell. I mean, I still remember as a kid seeing the news of him dying mysteriously on his ship. And obviously, there's been a lot of speculation he may have worked for Mossad, and obviously, now you mentioned the KGB and stuff. I mean, I'm assuming there's no Russian connection to his death that we know of, is there?
There's no Russian connection that we know of. Obviously, many people are still very skeptical about whether he committed suicide or whether it was an accident.
Mm,
There's several former KGB directors who are on the record saying that Maxwell was a KGB agent and was useful to them. But it will obviously these terms, agent, you have to be quite careful. I mean, because it's very, it's not as if he was a full-time intelligence officer. He was not, but he was used by them to either promote Soviet Union foreign policy, or they would pay him a huge amount of money to publish very sycophantic biographies of communist leaders in East Europe, and basically help them in any way he could as a
mm.
major publisher.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm assuming with a few agents of influence, they can sort of cross over into that term that we call useful idiot, where they don't necessarily know that they're being used to sort of push an ideology or information.
Yeah, MPs are a good example of that. But throughout the Cold War, several Labour MPs were in touch and had meetings with officials from
Mm,
the embassy, the Soviet embassy in London, and they became, in varying degrees, as you say, useful idiots. They'd come from the background of the 1930s, where very left wing and socialist and supported the Soviet Union as much because they were so opposed to fascism and the Nazis. And then
mm,
during the Cold War, there were some Labour MPs who I refer to who remained supportive of communism and the Soviet Union to varying degrees, and they couldn't bring themselves to admit the brutality and the oppression of the communist regime. And they hung in there, hoping that the aspirations of communism would finally come through, and it would be worth supporting and overlooking the brutalities and the oppression. So they would provide information, these MPs, to KGB or officers or undercover diplomats. It wouldn't necessarily be that sensitive, but it would be information that they could not get, mainly on sort of
mm.
political inside track on what was happening.
Yeah.
And so there's no question that several Labour MPs during the Cold War were KGB agents of influence, but you just have to be a bit careful in terms of how you categorize them.
Yeah, yeah, because it'd be very easy to sort of paint them as like sleeper agents or somebody actually trying to destabilize the UK when that most likely was not the case.
Yeah, I mean, just because a Labour MP, the classic example was Michael Foot,
Mm,
former leader of the Labour Party. There were allegations that he was a KGB agent, but the reality is that he was not. I mean, but he may have met a KGB officer in the UK because they saw he used to be editor of the Tribune newspaper, a left-wing newspaper, and he may have met them, but big deal.
Mm,
I mean, I know for a fact
mm,
that Dennis Healey, who's hardly a left-wing MP, Dennis Healey, when he was Shadow Foreign Secretary, he met KGB officers, and he knew that they were KGB officers. But that doesn't make Dennis Healey an agent of influence. Doesn't make him a traitor or an agent.
mm.
So I think you have to be very careful and forensic on how you categorize um, agents of influence.
Yeah, and there's a funny irony in all that too, because I think in your book and certainly in Oleg Gordievsky's biography, he mentions how the KGB, ironically, didn't really like far left or left wing politicians. They found them a little bit unreliable, or figures on the left, and they actually slightly preferred to the people on the right.
Yeah, I mean that's what's interesting is that the KGB thought that left-wing Labour MPs, or any really particularly right-wing, particularly like Social Democrats or right-wing Labour MPs who regard themselves as socialists, but the KGB saw them as kind of duplicitous and not really the holders of the faith of the socialist faith.
Mm,
So they actually preferred dealing with conservatives in a way because they knew what they were dealing with. It was conservative with a small c. It was clear cut, but with Labour MPs, there's sort of ambiguity in terms of, are they really true followers of the communist faith, and it was slightly sort of betraying communism by being social democratic or, a Neil Kinnock type
mm,
socialist.
mm,
So they preferred dealing with conservatives because it was more clear cut. I mean, and you have to remember that the Soviet Union, even under communism, is a very conservative state, and even under communism, I mean, in a sense, in one level, it's a conservative with a small c society. It's very organized, restricted. They don't like
mm.
change. And so that's what, in some ways, why they prefer dealing with conservative politicians in the UK.
They could kind of see a similar ground, yeah. Because I think I remember actually, I can't remember if it was in your book, but the KGB like frowned upon extramarital affairs and things like that. They were very,
Yeah.
not that I'm saying that's a good thing, but they were very conservative on issues like that, and
Mhm.
preferred their officers to be married and sort of and so on. So yeah, I can see that.
You could argue Putin is a very conservative person.
Mm,
He's in one argument, he's definitely not a Marxist or a communist, and there probably never was. But he's in a sense he's a conservative nationalist authoritarian,
mm,
and so in that sense they quite like dealing with the conservatives in the West because they felt that they knew what they were dealing with, and they sort of shared to some extent their values, and
mm.
that's the irony of it, really.
Indeed. Well, thank you for talking about Agents of Influence. Can you talk to us about the KGB's use of fake news and why they found it so effective?
So the KGB had a clear policy that in order to destabilize the West, disrupt them, damage the West in any way they can, they felt that it was more effective to flood the West with fake news
Mm,
and disinformation. This mainly related to forging documents, spreading false information, recruiting agents. But the main thing was, which I found in my research for the book, was they had a whole unit inside the KGB where they were literally faking documents on an industrial scale,
yeah.
and they had a whole unit devoted to this task. And this was during the Cold War, where it was a bit more difficult to check whether they were fake documents, although
Mm,
now we have artificial intelligence, so it's a different challenge. But the basic policy was twofold: forge documents and release them either anonymously or to targeted politicians or journalists or diplomats. And secondly, just spread disinformation, mainly how horrific the West was, and how the CIA were evil, and the Western politicians were corrupt or racist, and they didn't care if even like 80 or 90% of this fake news was regarded as a hoax, because that's still, if you're talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands of forged documents and fake stories every year, if you just have like 10% or 5% being accepted, they were happy with that because
Mm.
then that would have an impact. And there's evidence that, in some countries, um, these fake news were as accepted because what they did was that they focused mainly on third world countries who had a strong communist party. So they were particularly interested in spreading fake news through India. So they would start with a relatively, a country, not the US or the UK or Western Europe. They would plant a fake story about, CIA planning a coup or something in a country like um, India or in Africa in a left-wing newspaper, and then they would let it be published, and then they would wait a few months, and then they would telephone the Washington Post or the London Times or Le Monde in Paris and say, the CIA is planning this coup.
Mm.
And if the journalist said, "Well, how do you know?" And they said, "Well, it's been published already. Look at this obscure newspaper in Ghana or something." And so the mainstream journalists would then take it more seriously. So that was a particular operation that they employed by planting fake news in obscure journals and then sort of laundering it almost to try and get it out into the mainstream Western press.
One other thing I found very, very interesting was that Sun Tzu's The Art of War apparently was the favorite author and book of the Russian intelligence officers, and the best way to win a war was through influence operations. I don't know if there's anything you can sort of talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, so the strategy of the KGB and to this day, the FSB, is that they believed that an information war, in other words, spreading disinformation, recruiting agents, destabilization um, through the intelligence services, was actually as important, if not more important and effective than a military operation. And Putin himself has said publicly that what he found when he was a KGB officer in East Germany was that their operations, in some ways, were more effective and more important
Hmm.
than a military operation.
Mm.
Because if you have an operation where you're using disinformation and fake news, and it has the effect of destabilizing the opposition militarily, in thinking that they're losing, it can bolster the support of the morality of your troops where you're thinking that you win the war even if you're not. And also it helps to keep the support of ordinary Russian citizens back home. And I think that's happening today in the war in Ukraine, where there's all the fake information, the false stories and documents and fake news is having a military impact.
Mm.
And so the famous book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, was really like a Bible for the KGB because he argued that military operation, deceiving the enemy was as important as having the best weapons and the best troops and the best generals.
Yeah, and I was fascinated. Well, you mentioned there's some figures that apparently 75% of KGB efforts were devoted to ideological subversion or active measures, whilst then 25% of their efforts are actually directed towards traditional espionage. I found that fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the essence of the book, is that it shows that their priority and focus was to destabilize and destroy the West rather than do what most security services do, which is
Mm.
checking monitoring the security of the state by monitoring foreign spies inside Russia or any, threats to the nation's security. They were more interested in attacking the West and destabilizing on a political level. It was almost like an ideological war against the West, rather than being an intelligence gathering operation. And the main problem really was that they would have preconceived views of what the West was doing, and then try and find the intelligence to prove this preconceived conspiracy theory.
Mm.
And the main example of that was in the early 1980s, where the KGB launched an operation called Operation Ryan, where um, the Soviet Union believed that the West was going to launch nuclear war, and that Reagan and Thatcher was literally going to launch nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. And so they sent KGB officers out to try and find evidence that this was the case, and there wasn't any. And often they would just make it up. But again, it was this sort of preconceived notion of reality, and then you try and find the facts to prove your preconceived notion, and that happens in all aspects of human life.
Mm.
You know, we often think, oh, we think this is true, and let's go and try and find out to prove a preconceived view.
Mm.
And that happens everywhere, obviously, but it was very apparent during the Cold War
Mm.
that
Mm.
when they did this.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like Our Man in Havana, if we would talk about Graham Greene.
Yeah, I mean, it's a human trait sometimes, not just for the KGB, is that human beings often have a preconceived view of what the truth is,
Mm.
and then they try and fit the facts to prove this view, rather than go out with an open mind and try and find out what the situation is, and be open-minded and objective about it. And then sometimes the facts don't always fit your theories, and that's what they should have been doing. But they were the KGB was under such strict control by the Kremlin, and they were given orders, and it was, they would follow those orders
Mm.
regardless.
Yeah, and I think it may have been John Cipher you mentioned in your book. It was either John Cipher or a CIA officer mentioned that the KGB didn't really have much of an analytical department, whilst the CIA, I think half of it's devoted to analysis of intelligence.
Exactly. I think the KGB were very good technically, and they were
Mm.
very good at recruiting agents, surveillance, honey trapping. The operational side, I think they were very good. Where they were bad is analyzing that intelligence. So
Mm.
they would gather it in whatever form, and then they would send it back to Moscow. But then the problem was that because the Russian state was so ideological, and so it was based on that it had to be full. The intelligence needed to meet the ideological communist view of the world,
Mm.
and so it would get distorted, or it would get, Stalin certainly deleted, destroyed, inconvenient truths. And I think that happened all the way through, and still does today in Russia. And obviously, it's happened in the West. I think we have to be realistic.
Oh yeah.
The obvious example being the Iraq War, when Blair was prime minister, and they fitted the intelligence to make the political impetus of invading Iraq. So the West is not blameless or innocent in all
Mm.
this.
Mm.
But I think during the Cold War, it was such a rigid structure of intelligence of the KGB, certainly the Kremlin, not being very good at assessing and analyzing the
Mm.
intelligence coming in.
Certainly, with the war in Ukraine, just going into the present, there's certainly I think Putin believed that this war would be winnable in a very fast manner. I think some people have sort of jokingly said he believed it to be a 3-day war. And it does suggest that the Russian intelligence picture of potential victory in Ukraine was somewhat distorted.
Yeah, I think that, again, Putin uses the FSB as his sort of private police force,
Mm.
private army, really. And again, it's used as a political weapon. And the problem with that is that, the senior members of the FSB will tell Putin what he wants to hear, as
Mm.
opposed to what the truth is. And that's the problem. And that's why he got it so wrong about the invasion, how long it would take to succeed in Ukraine,
Mm.
because he was told by the FSB and his ministers and officials, "Oh, don't worry, it's not going to, will take a few days." But that's a classic view, a classic example of intelligence being manipulated or distorted to keep your political master happy.
Yeah.
And that had definitely happened during the Cold War, uh, and it's continued under Putin.
Mm. Mm. Indeed, indeed. Well, let's take a quick break and then we'll be right back. Can you talk to us about the KGB use of compromat?
So the KGB had a very organized operational strategy of gathering compromat, which mostly involved having agents to seduce and compromise Western diplomats or politicians or officials. So they actually had a training operational centers in Russia and Eastern Europe where they would train women, attractive women, and actually some men as well, to move to the West
Mm.
and target key politicians or officials or secretaries, and have a relationship with them, particularly if they were married. And the whole purpose was to sleep with them, and their relationship, usually in a hotel room, would be secretly filmed and recorded and photographed, and so they would be compromised, hence the word compromat. And the KGB would then use those photographs or recordings or information to blackmail the Western diplomat or spy or politician, wherever it is, to either um, become a spy for the Soviet Union and the KGB, or there's a chapter in my book about a conservative MP um, called Anthony Courtney, and he was honey trapped. He was a conservative MP that went to Moscow a lot, and he was very critical of the Soviet Union, very outspoken in his criticism. So they honey trapped him in a hotel in Moscow, and he was married, and they had photographs of him. But what they did was kind of interesting, is that they did not immediately try to blackmail him and say, "We've got photographs of you having an adulterous affair. If you don't work for us, we're going to release it to your wife or to your family." They kept the material, and then when he became more publicly critical of the Soviet Union and the KGB, they then anonymously released the material, the photographs, to 10 Downing Street, to MPs, to his family, to destroy. And I won't go into all the details, a whole chapter of the book about this MP, and the KGB destroyed the career of this conservative MP. And so they'll either use it to blackmail individuals to work for the KGB as a spy or agent, or literally just to destroy their career. So compromat in terms of using attractive women, but men, they hired men as well. East Germany, Stasi, for example, had a whole training camp where they would have male agents who were trained how to seduce lonely secretaries in NATO, or who were secretaries to the presidents of Western countries, to then have a relationship with them. And then those secretaries, had all the access to all the sensitive documents, would then leak documents to their boyfriend or whoever their lover. And so it was a very important operational tool. And compromat, you can argue, Putin became president because of a compromat operation.
Yeah, that
I
was very
won't go into
interesting.
all the detail, but when Putin was head of the FSB, there was a prosecutor general who was investigating corruption when Yeltsin was president and Putin was head of the KGB, FSB at the time. This is 1999, and the prosecutor general was named Skuratov, and he was getting too close to finding evidence of corruption in the Kremlin in 1999. Putin was head of the FSB, so they did a honey trap operation against him, and they launched an investigation, and they really went after him and smeared him through Russian TV. And the point is, this particular individual, Skuratov, who was the prosecutor general, was very close to a political rival of Putin. So his career was destroyed and damaged, the Skuratov. And Yeltsin was very grateful because the investigation was into corruption in Yeltsin's inner circle. That helped made Putin a sort of the successor to Yeltsin in 1999, anointed as his preferred successor. And then when they had the election in Russia in early 2000 or late 1999, Putin's rival, who was very close to Skuratov, was damaged by this.
Mm,
So you can argue
mm,
I think, very clearly that Putin was only became president of Russia because of a honey trap operation, and that's why I start the book with a description of this compromat operation
mm,
that
mm.
Putin was directly involved in, and that led to Putin becoming president of Russia.
Yeah, powerful stuff when it's used, isn't it?
I think the main point about compromat is it's not just about blackmailing people,
Mm,
but it's used as a weapon to to destroy people in different ways. It's not just saying, "Oh, here's the photographs," So, and they were very clever in keeping the files, keeping the evidence, and then using them at the right time.
mm. Yeah, yeah, indeed. So, in 1991, the KGB was officially disbanded, which many assumed meant the end of the tactics used during the Cold War. But did things really change in the FSB, which was created as its replacement?
When the FSB was created in 1991 under Yeltsin, after the end of the Cold War, people sort of assumed that the bad old days were gone.
Mm,
Um, Russia would become a more Western liberal type democracy, and of course, the truth is that never happened. The FSB operationally, the FSB continued their methods. Nothing changed. I think the only difference is that they weren't as politically powerful. They weren't
mm,
used as much, but in terms of operations, they did the same. The only difference is they changed the name, and the technology was different. Uh, but I think I don't think. I mean, I think the truth is they didn't have as much political influence
mm.
or power, but they operationally they carried on exactly the same in the 1990s.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Can you talk to us about Russian espionage efforts in the UK and if much has really sort of changed since the days of the Cold War?
Well, the Russian intelligence and East European intelligence regarded as UK as the second most important focus for intelligence gathering,
Mm, mm,
disinformation, destabilization. And so, they were very active here and in the UK. And that's where they focused on MPs. They would target the secretaries of MPs. Say an MP was chairman of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee. They would focus on the secretary
mm,
and try and seduce her or persuade her, or try and recruit her, because the secretary had access to all the documents and information. And so in the UK, it was done in a slightly more subtle way. I mean, they had KGB officers would go to like drinks parties, and even though they're undercover as a diplomat, and
mm,
people wouldn't necessarily know that they were KGB. They thought they were a foreign correspondent or a diplomat. And obviously the Soviet newspapers, TASS and Pravda, they on the surface they were journalists, but in reality they were working for the KGB in London.
mm,
And I think it was a bit more subtle in the UK in terms of recruiting of MPs, and they were quite clever in the way they did that. And so I think uh, how much impact they had, I mean, they certainly destroyed the career of one particular Conservative MP, and they certainly tried to influence elections in the UK
mm,
at every turn. And they saw left-wing Labour MPs as their way of doing that. Um, but I'm not sure to what extent they were successful. I mean, the main thing was to create some kind of chaos and disruption. on the British political scene. And obviously, historically, they recruited lots of agents, so they were successful, like Philby, Burgess, McLean, and
Mm.
um, so they were successful in that way. Um, and historically, I think they're probably more effective, but they're very active.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Well, couple of interesting things that have popped up in your book that are in the news at the moment. So you've got Seacox Heath, which is this sort of house in Tunbridge Wells, and it was just recently in the news because the building has diplomatic status, and I believe that's being withdrawn now, and there's a few expulsions sort of going on currently. I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on Seacox House.
Yes, I mean, what's interesting in London is how there are several properties that the KGB use,
Mm,
either as safe houses or where the KGB officers lived, pretending to be diplomats, and they use these as a place for where Western intelligence could cross the line. There's a house on Holland Park in London was a KGB officers have lived, and there was a fairly famous former MI5 officer called Bettany, and he wanted to cross the line and become an agent for the KGB in the 1980s. And he physically went to this house in Holland Park and put through the letterbox some secret documents. And the KGB thought this was a plant, so they didn't take it seriously.
yeah.
It was a classic example of KGB conspiracy mindedness, but properties in the UK obviously very important, and they have the importance of the house in Sussex called Seacox Heath, which
Mm,
is a huge country estate near Tunbridge Wells, is that it no longer has diplomatic status, so that whatever those individuals, the KGB officers who are based there, if they do something illegal, they can't plead diplomatic
mm,
immunity.
mm.
Um, but it was used and for many years as a kind of a base for training of agents in the UK. This sort of huge sort of Victorian mansion with large gardens, and now that's its diplomatic status has been removed, so it's vulnerable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do you think that means the Russian, because that property has been owned by the Russian government since I think 1946, so it has a lot of history here.
Yeah, and it's not been well known until recently. And
Mm,
I write about it in my book, and I've written a separate article about the property. And it's an amazing, uh, Gothic, almost 19th century, originally 19th century house. And local people down there, I think,
mm,
knew what was going on, but they could do nothing about it. And but I think there are other properties, certainly in London, in Kensington, Chelsea, South Kensington, Holland Park particularly is where they like uh, having properties, and it's more extensive than people realise. And if the British government is going to freeze the assets of the Russian state, they should look at property
yeah,
because that's where it's going to be easier to identify these properties which they could seize and sell. And that's a huge amount of property which has been used by KGB agents in London.
yeah. Do you think Seacox Heath could become a luxury hotel in the near future?
Definitely. If you go onto Google and you type in Seacox Heath, you look at the photographs,
Mm,
it's got tennis courts, huge gardens, amazing. It's an amazing, stunning property, very large. And if they decide to the West could confiscate this property and
mm.
take ownership of it, which legally may be a bit contentious. They could sell it easily for, I don't know, 20 million.
Yeah,
So they could certainly
yeah,
convert it. That money
yeah.
could go uh, to the Ukraine. At the end of the day, it's an illegal war. And so that would be the justification for confiscating that property.
Yeah, yeah, indeed, indeed. Well, what have you learned about Russia's use of disinformation today? That's possibly quite a wide question, but
Well, the mindset is the same. So there's no restraint on disinformation. They are told that the West is the enemy and could invade Russia at any moment, and that the West is, morally decadent and corrupt and hates Russia. So they're told
Mm.
these are the messages they're told, and so there's no limit. Point about disinformation is that they are given a license. The Russian agents are given a license to spread as much disinformation as possible. There's no limits. They can lie as much as they like, fake and forge. But now it's at a more frightening, much larger scale now, because obviously because of the intelligence, because of the technology,
Yeah.
and obviously with artificial intelligence and hacking and people using social media, the capacity and potential for disinformation is much bigger than it used to be. In the old days, during the Cold War, it was, um, restricted to, telephoning journalists or putting out fake leaflets or
Mm,
forging
mm,
documents and leaking material that way. Now you've got the whole, information highway where you can really uh, release vast amounts of data. And so I think it's much more important, pervasive, extensive now, not just in the Ukraine war, but in daily lives. And the Russians are very, very good at it. They're very
mm,
good on the
mm,
technological side of things. And for them, there's no limit. There's no, they really don't care. Um, doesn't matter how, you trace this back to Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky. They're quite openly talked about lying and cheating and deception
mm.
as a weapon against the West and preserving the Soviet Union and saving um, the communist regime. And I'm pretty sure that Putin believes the same thing. I mean, the old cliche, the ends justify the means, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's a good example in where we live today.
Yeah, I think there was some recent reporting that I read that estimated that Russia spends about $1 billion per year on disinformation efforts directed at the West, and apparently China spends $6 billion. I don't know if you've seen anything about the scale and sort of expense that they pay to do these things.
Well, during the Cold War, there was there's a CIA report detailing how much money the Soviet Union was spending
Mm,
on what they call active measures, which is just a term for disinformation and fake news and recruiting of agents. And well, from memory, that was hundreds of millions a year in the 1970s and 80s, which is a huge amount of money. And so that tells you how important it is for them. And a lot of it's very crude, but again, they have this view that you launch this operation of disinformation on a huge scale, some of it's going to stick, some of it's
mm,
going to
mm,
work,
mm,
and even if 10% or 5% is effective, then that's good enough. They don't care that most recipients of this fake news will understand it to be fake news. Uh, but some people are gullible or don't check or accept it. And I
mm,
think we're living in a period where, with artificial intelligence particularly, it's getting worse, and it's a huge, huge issue. So I hope governments, have units. I think they do to monitor it and try and
mm,
counter it in some way. But
mm,
it's like a monster you can't really control. But I often think it's as much about education and educating people, even at school, about there's a very simple thing about don't accept at first glance what you read or what
mm,
comes through your computer or a link or an email or a website. Just don't accept it at face value. And unfortunately, human beings, particularly if they have a preconceived view of the world, they will just reinforces their worldview, even if it's a crazy, you know, source.
Definitely, definitely. And I think that should be a priority in education today. I don't know whether, I think I have heard in some schools they do make an effort to talk about that, but I don't know across the board on a national level whether there is enough being done on that. So, I think I was saying to you off air, I was a victim myself of falling for conspiracy theories for many years in the early 2000s. And what I found quite interesting is some of those conspiracy theories do have their roots in Russian misinformation, and obviously more contemporary conspiracy theories definitely do have roots in Russian misinformation efforts. And there are certain figures who appear on sort of Russia Today or various other sort of Russian-based platforms who spread sort of lies about the West and try and I think their goal is just to make people sort of doubt their governments, doubt the institutions in the country, and sort of create some sort of infighting. And I was fascinated that the Information Research Agency, I believe it is, have literally offices of people and teams of people within those offices who sort of study different sort of cities and towns and countries and try and understand what the kind of should we say the touch points are that can create debates online that could go in Russia's favor. I found that really fascinating.
Yes, I mean, I think also, and I don't want to get into sort of cultural stereotypes, but I think there's some evidence that Russians and East Europeans are more prone to conspiracy theories than Western people, although I think it's hard to gauge, and that's based on a fear of fear, constantly feeling that they're under threat. For me, look at, and it's based on a historical track record of them being invaded and always feeling insecure. And so when you're feeling insecure, you latch on to conspiracies and conspiracy theories. And so in terms of people who believe in Western people who believe in conspiracy theories, it gives them a sense of certainty. I think it's a very complicated psychological mindset. And people who believe in conspiracy theories, it's not just because they're being influenced by Russia. It could be, I think, something to do with their own either personalities or the situation in their life. It gives a certain certainty, explains the world in a simplistic way. It gives you certainty, and it's also exciting. Conspiracy theories are exciting, and it's fun, and it's much more entertaining and interesting than the boring reality. And the boring reality of human beings and the world is it's complicated, and it's difficult, and it's subtle, and it's not clear cut. And human beings and the world is a complicated place, and always will be, always has been. But conspiracy theories gives you a certain sense of security.
Yeah.
Historical research is that there was this constant propensity to have a view of the world. I mean, the West has done this as well to some extent. Western people, you have a view of the world, and then you go out there and you try and find a website that will reinforce your preconceived view of the world. And it doesn't matter if that website is some lunatic, crazy, the guy in America. The obvious example is Alex Jones, a very good example of that. And he's a conspiracy theorist with a grotesque conspiracy that the shooting of the school children was a false flag and fake news. But people, believed it. I mean, I think in his case, it was a money-making operation. So the more conspiracy theories you put out there, you get more hits, and I think it was a money-making thing. But, he had a lot of success. He had a lot of people uh, believing him. And in America now, a lot of people who support Trump are conspiracy theorists. So it's not just because they're fed by Russian intelligence, but I think with technology, that's definitely an influence.
Yeah, indeed. With Alex Jones, I read he was making something like $3 million a month through his online efforts, which is, I wish I was making $3 million a month through my efforts, but
yeah, unfortunately, you're restricted by the truth and
yes,
trying to be accurate,
exactly,
and open-minded, and that's not as sexy or commercial.
No, sadly not.
So I think, yeah, I think that's a problem, and it's always going, and it's getting worse because of technology,
Mm, mm.
and people will go onto websites, will reinforce their view of the world. Whereas before the internet, you had old-fashioned books and newspapers and, human beings.
Yeah, yeah, you'd have to go to a library. Yeah, yeah, indeed, indeed. Well, let's quickly move to Vladimir Putin. So it looks like you can take the man out of the KGB, but you can't take the KGB out of the man. Can you talk to us a bit about sort of how Putin's actions and goals appear to come from a kind of KGB view of the world?
So Putin was a KGB officer throughout the
Mm,
1980s. He started in St. Petersburg, where he was, pretty relatively junior officer, harassing dissidents in the early 1980s in the Soviet Union. And, I don't think he was that operational. I think he was more of a desk officer. He was then
mm,
transferred to Dresden and East Germany, where he was much more operational, more senior, more involved in uh, again, this is I haven't studied this in great detail, but again, harassing, just putting Western people under surveillance, and he was a senior KGB officer. But the importance of his time in the KGB is what happened at the end of the Cold War, where he firsthand witnessed in East Germany the end of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall coming down, and Western people literally taking over East German cities like Dresden, where he was, and he famously
mm,
made a phone call to Moscow and said, I'm in the KGB office in Dresden. We're under attack. We need support. We need help. Otherwise, we're going to be taken over." And there was silence, and that was a huge influence on Putin because he basically thought that the old regime was weak, um, and not supportive of the KGB, and the West had triumphed, and it was a massive influence. And he spent most of his final days in the KGB officer destroying and burning and shredding documents.
mm,
So for him, it was a huge influence, and I think what it did, as I said earlier, is his famous quote that he said, "A spy can do more to influence events than any politician." I'm paraphrasing, but that's an on the record quote from Putin. And so the importance and the preeminence of the FSB when Putin became president of Russia is that he regarded, based on his own experience, the KGB as being incredibly important, and they are effectively his own private army and massively
mm,
politicized. I mean, they obviously were during the Cold War, but I think they've become more politicized. So he uses them as his own private political army and
mm,
police force.
indeed. For many years leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, many in the West regarded concerns about an increasingly aggressive Russia and its intelligence services as outdated Cold War paranoia. Do you believe we should be concerned about Russian intelligence activities targeting the West today?
I think with technology, Russian intelligence operations are even more active in the West than they used to be. And obviously with the Ukraine
Mm,
war, but I think under Putin, they've become much more active. It's not outdated. It's not old school or out of date to say that they're just as preeminent. There's been lots of cases of FSB and Russian intelligence operations in the West. The obvious examples being the murder of Litvinenko, the attempted assassination of Skripal, the former Russian intelligence officer in the UK, and efforts to influence British politics. Um, and there's been lots of cases, and there's even today, um, there's still a case that it will come up for trial of some Bulgarian um, intelligence agents in London who were charged with espionage.
mm,
And the evidence is that they were recruited and tasked by the FSB, and that's a historical well-known trick, but operation by the KGB and now the FSB of using East European Bulgarians, Czech Republic, Romanians, Albanians, whatever, as fronts to do UK
mm,
espionage. And these Bulgarian individuals have been charged and it's going to come up for trial. So and there have been lots of other cases of Russian intelligence. So I think it's a very much a current live issue, and it's going to get, I think
Mm,
it's got
mm.
worse rather than better.
Yeah, yeah, and there's even there's been some recent open cases that are being investigated about potential sabotage efforts in the UK and across Europe. There's certainly some fears about that.
Yeah, I think that with technology, particularly, I think they're probably even more active now than during the Cold War. So people who say, "Oh, it's sort of those sort of spying is out of date," well, actually, I think it's even more important. I mean, I think that the Cold War is back. We're living in a Cold War situation,
Mm,
and I think maybe in the 1990s there was a period when uh, in Russia they were more interested in the Russian oligarchs running Russia, and that was the priority there. But as soon as Putin became president, I mean, he's basically restored the Cold War, and that's where we are
mm.
now.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm always surprised, amazed when in the circle of friends of mine when I meet people who I think are very well informed. And I mentioned I had this as a spy podcast, and one of the comments that comes up occasionally is, "Do we even need spies anymore?" And I always find that really fascinating, especially in the day and age that we're in right now.
Well, it's a very strange, it's a bizarre comment, and I'm afraid quite ignorant, really,
Mm,
because obviously all governments need secret intelligence to
mm,
inform themselves on what's happening in the world.
mm,
You know, I mean, and you need to know what the real truth is inside foreign governments or agents or whatever the world
mm,
agency you're looking at to find out so that you can govern and influence your own foreign policy based
mm.
on what's really happening as opposed to what you read on the internet or in newspapers.
Yeah.
So, intelligence agencies play a really legitimate, important role
Mm,
because they are spies, okay, and their job is to get inside uh, foreign governments or agencies or whatever it is,
mm.
or the business community, to find out what's really happening.
Yeah.
And that's a legitimate role to preserve the security of the state. And so if you don't have spies, if you don't have intelligence agencies, well, how are you going to base your decision making on? On what
Mm,
basis, you're going to do it on the basis of what you read in newspapers or on the internet or on TV? I mean, that'll be ludicrous, ridiculous
mm, mm.
thing, even though I say that as a journalist. But, I think intelligence agencies, even though they've been involved in some very controversial,
Mm,
illegal, and have done some terrible things in many ways, I think they also perform a really important function
mm,
in a democracy or in a regime so that we're all informed and the governments are informed of what the true situation is. The problem is when they're used as a political weapon,
mm.
which happened with the KGB in the Cold
Yeah.
War, and Blair did it during the Iraq War,
Yeah.
and the Americans have done it. So, that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, and it's a slippery slope when it does do that. Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you for your time today. Do you have any sort of final thoughts you wish to include before we wrap up? Is there anything you want to discuss that we haven't discussed today that's important to you?
I think that the only point I would make is that when my book was published, people said,
Mm,
well, you know, it doesn't really demonstrate that they have subverted or
mm,
destroyed Western democracy. But the point is, there is evidence of where they did, particularly with this operation against a conservative MP who was anti-Soviet and anti-KGB. They destroyed his career. It's as simple as that.
mm.
So it does have some impact. But I think you have to understand that the sheer scale of Russian intelligence operations against the West is phenomenal, and
Yeah.
we'll never be able to discover the scale of it and the intensity of it. But it is phenomenal, and most experts and analysts would agree with that.
Mm,
They can't necessarily assess the scale of it, but and so again, even if 10% of what they're doing um, has an impact, that is also huge. So I would say that this is why we have to take it seriously, and that's why it's important.
Yeah, indeed. Well, myself and my colleague Matt run a show every 2 weeks called Espresso Martini, where we look at the sort of current spy stories, and frequently Russia is always, it comes up almost every other episode. There's something that they're involved with that they're trying to do that's particularly targeting the West. So I think, it is important that we're aware of it. And obviously Russia are constantly trying to do things. How successful they are or they're not is another matter, really. But they are trying.
That's for sure.
Well, Mark, where can listeners sort of find out more about you, your work, and your excellent book?
Well, my book is called Agents of Influence, How the KGB Subverted Western Democracies. You can buy the book. It's in paperback now, and you can obviously get it on Amazon or most bookshops, Waterstones. And in terms of my other articles, you can read my work on my website, which is www.markhollingsworth.co.uk. And that's probably the best way to access my work.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, thank you for joining me today. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.